All right, let's jump right in. When you hear the name Adam Smith, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Probably something like the father of modern economics, right? The guy who championed capitalism. But what if I told you that's only half the story? And honestly, maybe not even the most important half. Today we are going to completely rethink the man we thought we knew.
Yeah, this is the one. This is the classic quote everyone learns in Econ 101. It's the bedrock of that popular image of Adam Smith, the guy who basically said self-interest is what makes the world go round. And look, it's a powerful line, it's super memorable, but it is also profoundly misunderstood.
So it's pretty easy to read that quote and just jump to a simple conclusion, isn't it? That Adam Smith was basically giving a big philosophical thumbs up to greed. Greed is good and all that. But was that really what he was arguing? That is the central question we are going to tackle right now. Okay, so to get to the real Adam Smith, we first have to peel back this myth that's grown up around him. See, the myth is really just a caricature of his work. It takes one brilliant idea and acts like it was his only idea. And that is just a tiny piece of a much, much bigger and way more fascinating story.
And this is the Adam Smith we all know, right? The one on posters and in the textbooks, the architect of the free market, the guy who talked about the invisible hand, where somehow our individual self-interest magically leads to the public good. It's a really neat, tidy package. But it's also just deeply incomplete. And to understand why, we've got to go back in time, way before he was ever known as an economist. And here is where the story takes a huge twist. Because before Adam Smith was ever celebrated as an economist, he was a famous professor of moral philosophy. Think about that. His main field wasn't markets, it was morality. He wasn't focused on what makes us rich. He was focused on what makes us good.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Just look at these dates. His big book on ethics, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, came out in 1759. But The Wealth of Nations, his super famous economics book, didn't come out until a full 17 years later. That is not just a trivia fact, folks. It's the absolute key to understanding his entire way of thinking.
So, what exactly did this moral philosopher have to say? Well, in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith asks this really fundamental question. How do we, as these naturally self-interested creatures, ever develop a conscience? How do we even learn to be good people? And his answer? Well, it pretty much boils down to two core ideas.
Okay, so the first big idea is something he called sympathy. But hold on. For Smith, sympathy isn't just, feeling sad because someone else is sad. He describes it as an act of the imagination. It's about projecting yourself into someone else's situation and asking, how would I feel if that happened to me? So it's more of a mental exercise, not just some emotional gut reaction. Now, this might sound like a subtle difference, but trust me, it's a huge deal. His good friend, the philosopher David Hume, he saw sympathy more like an emotional virus. You just catch the feeling from someone else, kind of like catching a yawn. But Smith's idea is totally different. It's an act of judgment. By imagining how we would react, we can then decide if someone else's emotion is, appropriate or justified. And that is the very first step toward building a real conscience. So building on this idea of sympathy, Smith gives us his second big concept, the impartial spectator. The easiest way to think of this is like your inner conscience, or an internalized referee. He says that by watching how other people react to our behavior and to the behavior of others, we slowly build up this internal, impartial viewpoint. It's what lets us step back and judge our own actions from a distance. It's that voice inside your head that nudges you toward what's fair and proper, helping you rise above your own immediate, biased feelings. And all these pieces, they just click together perfectly, like a little moral machine. So you see an action, you imagine yourself in that situation, you check in with that inner referee, your impartial spectator. And then, boom, you make a moral judgment about whether that action was right or wrong. For Adam Smith, this is literally how we learn to be good people. Okay, so if Smith spent an entire book explaining how we become moral people through sympathy and this inner conscience, then how on earth do we get back to the butcher, the brewer, and their self-interest, right? Well, this is where we finally connect the dots and solve what people have called the Adam Smith problem. Here is probably the best analogy I've heard for it. For Adam Smith, morality is the operating system for all of society. And the market, with all its self-interest, that's just one app running on top of that OS. And think about it. That app is completely useless if the operating system crashes. And Smith himself makes this crystal clear. He basically argues that before you can even have a functioning market, you first need a functioning society, and that society has to be built on a foundation of justice and trust and just basic moral behavior. I mean, a society full of cheats and thieves, it could never sustain commerce. The moral foundation has to come first.
So you see, for Smith, self-interest is not the whole story of human nature, not even close. It's just the most effective motivation inside a very specific box: commercial transactions between strangers. Think about it. When you're dealing with your family, you're driven by love and affection, right? When you're dealing with your community, maybe it's a sense of duty or benevolence. But when you're dealing with a baker you've never met, well, in that case, self-interest is the most reliable language you can both speak.
And hey, for anyone out there who still thinks Smith was just some cheerleader for the rich, he literally wrote this in The Wealth of Nations. He knew that the whole point of a commercial society wasn't just to make a few people wealthy. It was to create a flourishing and happy society for everyone. For him, widespread poverty wasn't a bug in the system, it was a sign of total failure.
So when you put it all together, you see there aren't two different Adam Smiths. There's just one. One thinker with a single unified vision for a society that is both good and prosperous.
You know, for decades, academics have debated what they call the Adam Smith problem. This supposed contradiction between the sympathy in his first book and the self-interest in his second. But as we've just seen, it's not really a problem at all, is it? The two books are completely complementary. One describes the moral foundation, the OS. The other describes the economic activity, the app, that rests right on top of it.
Now, let's be fair. Smith's theory isn't perfect. Critics have pointed out that our impartial spectator can definitely be biased by the culture we grow up in, and his theory doesn't exactly give you a clear rulebook for every single tough moral choice. But Smith himself had this one major worry, that, wow, it feels incredibly relevant today. He was afraid that intense political factionalism, extreme tribalism, could completely short-circuit our moral compass.
So if there's one thing you take away from all this, let it be this. Adam Smith was not an apologist for greed. He was a moral philosopher first and foremost, who saw capitalism as an incredibly powerful tool, but a tool that would only work if it was operating on a solid foundation of sympathy and justice.
And that leaves us with a really challenging thought to end on. Smith's big insight, way back in the 18th century, was that a moral society is the foundation for a wealthy one, not the other way around. So as we look at the world today, you have to ask yourself, have we forgotten that?